Stop trying to avoid what scares you. Every moment you spend in resistance, you're performing a quantum measurement that collapses probability waves directly toward what you're fighting against. Your consciousness doesn't distinguish between wanted and unwanted observation. It only measures what you're pointing it at, and resistance points it straight at the thing you're trying to escape. The unwanted patterns in your life aren't accidents or bad luck. They're probability fields being continuously recreated through the mechanism of resistance itself. There's a specific protocol that breaks this loop, not through more effort or better affirmations, but through recognizing how observation actually functions at the quantum level. Once you see that your attention is the measuring device and resistance is just intense observation disguised as protection, everything inverts. The chronic patterns dissolve. New possibilities become visible. You're about to discover the single paradox that makes you stop attracting what you don't want.
Your resistance is creating it. Right now, in this exact moment, the thing you're trying hardest to avoid is being magnetically pulled into your experience. Not because the universe is cruel, not because you're cursed or blocked or lacking something, but because of a specific mechanism in how consciousness interfaces with probability fields that almost nobody understands. And the moment you see this mechanism clearly, everything inverts. What you've been desperately pushing away simply stops showing up. Not through more effort, not through better techniques, through the recognition of a single paradox that's been operating beneath every unwanted experience you've ever had. Let me show you what's actually happening. Every time you try to avoid something, you wake up in the morning and immediately there's a thought about the thing you don't want. Maybe it's financial stress. Maybe it's relationship conflict. Maybe it's health anxiety or career stagnation or loneliness. Whatever it is, the thought arrives uninvited, and your system immediately contracts around it. You feel the tightness in your chest, the heaviness in your stomach, the tension in your shoulders. And then your mind does what it's been trained to do. It tries to push the thought away, tries to focus on something else, tries to affirm the opposite, tries to distract itself with action or consumption or planning. This feels productive. This feels like you're doing something about the problem. You're not just accepting the unwanted reality. You're actively working against it. You're being proactive, responsible, smart. But here's what's actually occurring at the level where reality gets constructed. Every single time you resist something, every moment you spend trying to push it away or avoid it or make sure it doesn't happen, you're performing a specific type of quantum measurement. You're collapsing probability waves around the exact thing you're trying to avoid. Your consciousness is selecting that specific outcome from the field of all possible outcomes and saying, this is what I'm observing. This is what I'm paying attention to. This is what matters. And reality, which is not a fixed structure but a responsive probability field that organizes itself around observation, reads that signal and delivers more of what you're observing, not what you want, what you're actually paying attention to through your resistance. The paradox is devastatingly simple. The more you resist something, the more attention you give it. The more attention you give it, the more you observe it. The more you observe it, the more probable it becomes. Your resistance is the measurement that collapses probability waves toward the exact outcome you're trying to avoid. I discovered this mechanism by observing patterns across hundreds of people who kept manifesting the same unwanted experiences despite trying every technique to change their reality. What became clear was that they were all spending enormous amounts of consciousness in active resistance to what they didn't want. Someone terrified of being alone would spend hours each day monitoring for signs of rejection, planning to avoid abandonment, worrying about ending up isolated. Their mind justified this as self-protection, as being realistic, as preparing for the worst. But energetically, what they were doing every single day was collapsing probability waves around isolation. They were observing it constantly, giving it more attention than anything else in their life. The resistance to loneliness was a continuous measurement that selected isolation from the field of all possible relational realities. And reality kept matching that measurement. Not because they were manifesting it through some mystical law of attraction, because consciousness was performing the quantum function of observation and collapse. And they were observing the exact thing they were trying to avoid. The shift happens when you finally see the mechanism clearly, when you recognize that you're not preparing for the unwanted outcome, you're creating it through continuous observation disguised as resistance. The moment you see this, something fundamental changes, not in circumstances, but in your relationship to them. You stop resisting, not because you become passive or stop taking action, but because you recognize that resistance itself is the problem, that fighting against something is the exact mechanism that keeps it stable in your experience. In the comments, drop one thing you've been resisting that keeps showing up in your life. Maybe it's conflict, maybe it's scarcity, maybe it's rejection, maybe it's something uniquely yours. Let this be a recognition, a quantum signal that you're ready to see the mechanism clearly. Let me explain precisely what happens at the quantum level when you resist something, because understanding the mechanism makes it impossible to keep doing it unconsciously. In quantum mechanics, there's a principle called the observer effect. The act of observation collapses probability waves into specific outcomes. Before observation, multiple possibilities exist in superposition, all equally real at the quantum level. But the moment conscious observation occurs, that superposition collapses into a single actualized outcome. This isn't mysticism. This is verified, repeatable physics. Experiments like the double-slit experiment prove that observation fundamentally changes what manifests at the quantum level. But what most people don't understand is that this doesn't just happen in laboratories with subatomic particles. This happens continuously in your lived experience. Your consciousness is constantly performing observation that collapses probability fields into specific manifestations. And here's the critical piece that changes everything. Your consciousness doesn't distinguish between wanted and unwanted observation. It doesn't matter if you're observing something because you desire it or because you fear it. The act of observation itself collapses probability toward whatever you're observing. When you resist something, you're not pushing it away. You're observing it intensely, continuously, with enormous amounts of attention and energy. And that observation is a measurement that makes it more probable in your experience. Think about how a measuring device works. A thermometer doesn't care if you want the temperature to be higher or lower. It simply measures what is and responds accordingly. Your consciousness works the same way. It's a measuring device that collapses probability based on what it's pointed at, regardless of whether you like what you're measuring. When you resist something, you're pointing your consciousness directly at it. You're measuring it constantly, and reality responds to that measurement by organizing itself around what you're observing. This is why affirmations often fail. People try to affirm, "I am financially abundant," while their actual attention, their real observation, is focused on the financial lack they're trying to override. They spend 30 seconds affirming abundance and 23 hours observing lack through worry, planning, checking accounts, calculating shortfalls. The 30 seconds of intended observation gets completely overwhelmed by the 23 hours of resistance-based observation, and reality responds to where the actual attention is, not where you wish it was. Let's get specific about what resistance looks like in your direct experience, because you can't change a pattern you can't recognize. Resistance isn't just the obvious things like worrying or complaining or feeling afraid. Those are manifestations of resistance. But the resistance itself operates much deeper. Resistance is any moment when your consciousness is oriented toward what you don't want instead of what you do want. Anytime you're thinking about how to avoid something rather than how to create something. Any instance where you're managing threats rather than exploring possibilities. This shows up in subtle ways you've probably never noticed. You're in a conversation and you're monitoring how the other person is perceiving you. adjusting your presentation to avoid negative judgment. That's resistance. You're observing negative judgment as a probability you need to manage, which makes it more probable. You're working on a project, and you're primarily motivated by not failing rather than by creating something excellent. That's resistance. You're observing failure as the thing to avoid, which collapses probability toward failure-adjacent experiences. You're in a relationship, and you're constantly vigilant for signs of conflict or disconnection, trying to prevent problems before they occur. That's resistance. You're observing potential conflict continuously, which makes conflict more probable than if you were simply present with what actually is. The resistance feels protective. It feels like you're being smart and proactive. But energetically, it's a constant stream of observation pointed at unwanted outcomes, which is a measurement function that makes those outcomes more likely to actualize. Here's how to verify this in your own experience right now. Bring to mind something you've been resisting, something you really don't want to happen or continue happening. Got it? Good. Now notice what happens in your body when you think about this thing. There's contraction, isn't there? Tightening in your chest or stomach or shoulders. That physical contraction is the manifestation of consciousness contracting around the unwanted thing. You're literally wrapping your awareness around it, which is observation, which is measurement, which collapses probability toward it. Now notice how much time you spend thinking about this thing you don't want. Not just the obvious worry sessions, but the background mental processing, the planning for contingencies, the rehearsing of responses, the analyzing of how to avoid it, the checking to see if it's getting worse. Add it all up honestly. You're probably spending hours every day in active observation of the exact thing you're trying to push out of your experience. And every one of those hours is a quantum measurement that makes it more probable. If this strikes a chord and fills a gap for you, consider staying connected here. Subscribe and hit the bell icon next to it. This isn't just a channel, it's a frequency. If you felt a nudge or a change while watching, you're already tuned in. We're not just watching content, we're practicing new ways of being. We're not just absorbing, we're creating possibilities. We're not just learning, we're remembering. I'm truly glad you're here. Let's keep growing and shifting together. Now here's where this gets practical, where understanding becomes transformation. Once you see that resistance creates observation, and observation collapses probability toward what you're observing, the solution becomes obvious. Not easy, but obvious. You have to stop resisting. Not through passivity, not through denial, not through forced positivity, through genuine recognition that resistance itself is the mechanism creating what you don't want. But this is where most people get stuck. They understand intellectually that resistance creates what they're resisting, but they can't figure out how to stop resisting. Because the moment they try to stop resisting, they're resisting their resistance, which is just another layer of the same pattern. They're observing resistance as something to avoid, which makes resistance more probable. The trying to stop becomes another form of the same mechanism. The actual shift happens through something completely different, not through stopping resistance, but through shifting what you're observing. Let me show you exactly how this works. Right now, bring back that thing you've been resisting. Feel the contraction. Notice the resistance. But instead of trying to stop the resistance, simply shift your observation to something else. Not to the opposite of what you don't want, not to an affirmation or visualization, to something that's actually present in your direct experience right now that you do want. Maybe it's the fact that you're breathing easily. Maybe it's the comfort of where you're sitting. Maybe it's the curiosity you feel taking this in. Maybe it's the capability of your mind to understand complex concepts. Find something real, something actually present, something you genuinely appreciate or want more of, and observe that. Not as a technique to make the unwanted thing go away, not as a distraction from what you're resisting, but as a genuine shift in where your consciousness is pointed. What you'll notice if you actually do this instead of just reading about it is that the contraction begins to release, not because you forced it to, but because you withdrew observation from what you were resisting. You stopped measuring it, and without continuous measurement reinforcing it, the probability field starts to relax around it. This doesn't make the unwanted thing instantly disappear from your experience, but it stops the mechanism that was continuously recreating it through resistant observation. When people practice this consistently, something remarkable happens. They notice themselves in resistance dozens of times per day initially, then consciously shift observation to something actually present that they want. Sometimes it's as simple as noticing food available to eat. Sometimes it's appreciating a skill or capability they possess. Sometimes it's just the sensation of the body functioning properly, breathing and circulating blood without conscious management. The first week is usually challenging because the pattern pulls back toward resistance within minutes. But with continued practice of shifting without judgment, without making the resistance mean something about progress, gaps begin to appear by week 2. Moments where resistance isn't present at all. Where consciousness is simply with what is, rather than contracted around what's feared. By week 3, the background tension that had been constant for years starts to quiet. Not because circumstances changed, but because the resistance mechanism stopped being fed with continuous observation. And then something remarkable happens around week 4. Opportunities start appearing that have nothing to do with previous strategies. Unexpected connections, resources from forgotten sources. The pattern shifts not through effort, but through the withdrawal of resistant observation that was locking a specific probability in place. Let me show you how to identify exactly what you've been unconsciously attracting through resistance. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. And that recognition alone begins to dissolve the mechanism. For the next 7 days, keep a simple log. Every evening, write down 3 things that happened during the day that you didn't want. Not huge disasters, just the daily frustrations, conflicts, disappointments, obstacles, the difficult conversation, the unexpected expense, the body discomfort, the project setback, whatever showed up that you wished hadn't. After you list those 3 things, trace each one back. Ask yourself honestly, have I been resisting this type of experience? Not this specific instance, but this category of unwanted outcome. If the unwanted thing was a conflict with someone, have you been in resistance to conflict generally? Trying to avoid it? Managing your behavior to prevent it? Worrying about it happening? If it was a financial surprise, have you been in resistance to financial instability? Constantly checking and planning and worrying about money? What you'll discover is that almost everything unwanted that shows up in your experience is something you've been actively resisting. Not causing through your actions, but collapsing into probability through resistant observation. The difficult person you keep encountering is the manifestation of your resistance to difficulty in relationships. The recurring health issues are the manifestation of your resistance to your body being unreliable. The money problems are the manifestation of your resistance to financial insecurity. This recognition can be confronting. Your mind might want to reject it, to argue that you're not creating these things, that they're happening to you from outside circumstances. But stay with the investigation. Look honestly at where your attention has actually been, not where you wish it was, where it actually is. How much time do you spend observing through resistance the exact categories of experience that keep showing up unwanted? By day 7 of this log, the pattern becomes undeniable. You're in a feedback loop where resistance creates observation. Observation collapses probability. Unwanted experience manifests, which triggers more resistance, which creates more observation, which collapses more probability toward the same unwanted pattern. You've been locked in this loop possibly for years, maybe your entire life, never recognizing that the resistance itself was the mechanism perpetuating what you were trying to escape. Drop a word in the comments that represents what you're ready to stop resisting. Fear, lack, conflict, pain. Your word matters. It's a quantum declaration that you're stepping out of the loop. Now that you understand the mechanism and you've identified your specific patterns, you need a practice that actually interrupts the loop. Not through more resistance, but through genuine non-resistance. This is subtle and requires precision, because most of what people call letting go or acceptance is actually just another form of resistance disguised as spirituality. Here's the practice that actually works. 3 times per day, morning, midday, and evening, take 10 minutes to do this protocol. Sit comfortably and bring to mind the thing you've been most actively resisting. Feel the resistance fully. Don't try to change it or make it go away. Just feel the actual sensation of resistance in your body, the contraction, the tension, the recoil. Notice exactly where it is and what it feels like. Then ask yourself this specific question: what is this resistance protecting me from? Not why am I resisting, but what is the resistance trying to protect? Sit with this question until an answer emerges. Usually it's something like, it's protecting me from being destroyed, from being humiliated, from being abandoned, from losing everything. The resistance isn't random. It's a protection mechanism that believes it's keeping you safe from something devastating. Once you identify what the resistance is protecting you from, ask the next question. Is this protection actually working? Is the resistance actually preventing what it's afraid of? Or is it creating more of what it fears? Look honestly at your direct experience. Has years of resisting financial instability made you more financially stable or less? Has resisting conflict made your relationships more peaceful or more tense? Has resisting health problems made your body more reliable or more problematic? When you see clearly that the resistance isn't working, that it's actually perpetuating what it fears, something shifts. Not because you've forced anything, but because you've seen through the mechanism. The resistance was operating on a false premise, that continuous, vigilant observation of threats keeps you safe from those threats. But now you understand that continuous observation collapses probability toward what you're observing. The premise is revealed as backwards. From this recognition, you can make a conscious choice, not to stop being afraid, not to pretend everything is fine, but to stop investing attention in the unwanted outcome through resistance. You can acknowledge that yes, unwanted things are possible, and simultaneously stop observing them continuously through worried management. You can recognize that challenges might occur and simultaneously stop monitoring for them constantly through protective vigilance. This is genuine non-resistance, not forced positivity, not spiritual bypassing, not denial, just the withdrawal of continuous resistant observation from unwanted possibilities. And when you practice this 3 times daily for 30 days, your probability field begins to reorganize itself around different observations. The unwanted patterns that were stable through continuous resistant measurement start to destabilize. And new possibilities that were always present but filtered out by your resistance-focused observation begin to actualize in your experience. The most powerful application of this understanding is learning to consciously direct your observation toward what you actually want. Not as manipulation or technique, but as the natural function of consciousness once resistance is removed. Your consciousness is always observing something, always performing measurements that collapse probability. The question is, are you directing those measurements consciously or letting resistance direct them unconsciously? Here's a 30-day protocol that retrains your observation patterns at a fundamental level. This isn't manifestation work in the traditional sense. This is learning to use your consciousness the way it's actually designed to function, as a probability collapsing mechanism that creates your experienced reality through the function of observation. Week 1. Observation awareness. Throughout each day, set a timer to go off every 2 hours. When it goes off, pause and notice, what was I just observing? Not what was I doing, but where was my attention actually pointed? Was I observing what I want or what I don't want? Was I in resistance or in presence? Don't judge what you discover. Just build awareness of where your observation actually goes when you're not consciously directing it. Most people are shocked when they do this honestly. They discover they're observing unwanted possibilities 70 to 80% of the time, checking for threats, planning to avoid problems. worrying about what might go wrong, managing other people's perceptions, protecting against potential failures. Their consciousness is spending most of its measurement capacity on probabilities they don't want, which is why those probabilities keep actualizing. Week 2. Conscious redirection. Now, when the timer goes off, not only notice where your observation was, but consciously redirect it. Find something present in your direct experience that you actually want. Something real, not imagined or visualized. Maybe it's a capability you have. Maybe it's a relationship that works. Maybe it's something in your environment you appreciate. Observe it fully for 60 seconds. Feel what it's like to have your consciousness pointed at something wanted rather than something resisted. This is harder than it sounds because your mind will try to pull you back into resistance almost immediately. It will say things like, "Yes, but what about the problem? What about the threat? What about the thing that might go wrong?" That's the resistance pattern trying to reclaim your observation. Just notice it and keep your attention on what you're consciously choosing to observe. You're retraining your consciousness to function as a tool you direct rather than as an automatic threat scanning system. Week 3. Extended observation. Now extend the practice. Instead of just 60 seconds when the timer goes off, maintain conscious observation of wanted present realities for 5-minute periods throughout your day. You're building observation stamina, the capacity to keep your consciousness pointed at what you want long enough for probability to begin collapsing around it. This is when you'll start noticing shifts in your external experience, not because you're manifesting through willpower, but because you're finally using observation the way it actually functions. Week 4. Integrated observation. By week 4, the practice becomes integrated into your natural way of being. You catch yourself in resistance more quickly. You redirect to wanted observation more automatically. You start to feel the difference between resistance-based observation, which contracts and depletes, and wanted observation, which expands and energizes. Your probability field begins organizing itself around fundamentally different measurements, and your experienced reality starts reflecting that reorganization. Make sure you share this video with someone who's been stuck in a pattern they can't seem to break. You might be showing them the invisible mechanism that's been keeping it in place. By sharing, you're spreading an understanding that could free someone from years of unconscious resistance, and that shift you create in someone else's field amplifies your own quantum signature. Now we come to the heart of the paradox that changes everything. The thing you've been resisting, the outcome you've been desperately trying to avoid, loses its power the moment you stop resisting it. Not because you've defeated it or escaped it, but because you've stopped the continuous measurement that was collapsing probability toward it. This sounds too simple to be true. Your mind wants transformation to be complex, to require intense effort and years of work. But the actual mechanism is devastatingly simple. Stop observing what you don't want through resistance. Start observing what you do want through presence, and probability reorganizes itself accordingly. The paradox is that you can't stop resisting through trying to stop. The trying is resistance to resistance. You can only stop resisting through seeing clearly that resistance creates what it fears. And that seeing happens through the practices I've given you, through direct experience of how your observation actually functions, through repeated verification that withdrawn resistant observation allows unwanted patterns to dissolve, while directed wanted observation allows desired patterns to emerge. People who live from this understanding for extended periods report complete transformations, not because they work harder or have better strategies, but because they stop collapsing probability toward unwanted outcomes through resistant observation. They simply don't spend consciousness in that way anymore. When concerns arise, and they still do occasionally, they notice them without resistance, acknowledge them without obsessive observation, and return attention to what's actually present that they want. Relationships transform. The patterns of conflict that persisted for years simply stop manifesting. Not because people change, but because the observer stops collapsing probability toward conflict through protective vigilance. They stop measuring for threats in every interaction. And without that continuous measurement, the probability of conflict drops dramatically, while the probability of genuine connection increases. Health stabilizes. Mysterious symptoms that seemed permanent quiet down, not through finding the right protocol or supplement, but through stopping the resistant observation of the body as unreliable and threatening. This isn't to say life becomes perfect, or that unwanted things never happen. Reality is probabilistic, not deterministic. But the chronic patterns, the recurring unwanted experiences that were stable through years of resistance, those dissolve because the measurement feeding them stops. And the space that opens up allows different probabilities to actualize, possibilities that had always been present but were filtered out by resistance-focused observation. Everything I've described can sound theoretical or abstract, even though it's pointing to direct, immediate, verifiable experience. So let me give you a specific challenge that will prove whether this mechanism is real or just sophisticated language. Choose one thing you've been actively resisting, just one, not the biggest thing, not the scariest thing, something real but manageable. Maybe it's a difficult person you have to interact with regularly. Maybe it's a financial pressure that's constant but not devastating. Maybe it's a body discomfort that's annoying but not debilitating. For the next 14 days, commit to complete non-resistance to this one thing, not forced acceptance, not pretending it's fine, not denying it exists, just the withdrawal of resistant observation. Every time you notice yourself thinking about it, planning around it, worrying about it, checking if it's getting worse, stop. Acknowledge that you noticed the resistance pattern and consciously redirect your observation to something present that you want. Do this every single time for 14 days. Also, keep a log. Write down at the start what you're choosing to stop resisting. Write down honestly how often you currently observe it through resistance. Roughly how many times per day you find yourself thinking about it, managing it, worrying about it. Then track what actually happens over the 2 weeks. Not what you hope will happen. What actually occurs in your direct experience. Does the unwanted pattern stay the same, get worse, or begin to shift? If this mechanism is real, if resistance truly creates observation that collapses probability toward unwanted outcomes, then withdrawing resistant observation should cause measurable change, not instantly, not magically, but probabilistically over a 2-week period. The pattern should begin to destabilize. The frequency or intensity should shift. New possibilities should start appearing that weren't accessible while you were locked in resistant observation. And if this doesn't happen, if after 14 days of genuine non-resistance, the pattern is exactly the same or worse, then you have direct evidence that what I'm describing isn't accurate for your experience. The verification is built into the practice itself. You're not asked to believe anything. You're invited to test whether your observation actually functions the way quantum mechanics suggests, as a probability collapsing measurement that creates your experienced reality. All of this, every mechanism I've described, every practice I've given, every explanation of quantum observation and probability collapse, points to a single recognition that changes everything once you see it clearly. You're not a victim of reality. You are not experiencing outcomes that happen to you from outside forces you can't influence. You are continuously collapsing probability through observation, and resistance is the unconscious way you've been directing that observation toward exactly what you don't want. This recognition is simultaneously liberating and confronting. Liberating because it means you have far more influence over your experience than you realized. Your consciousness isn't passive. It's actively constructing what you experience through the function of observation. Confronting because it means you can't blame circumstances anymore. The patterns you've been experiencing aren't happening to you. They're being perpetuated by how you're using your observation, specifically through resistance. But this isn't about blame or judgment. You didn't know how observation actually works. Nobody taught you that consciousness collapses probability through measurement. You were doing what you were trained to do: resist threats, avoid problems, Protect yourself through vigilant observation of everything that could go wrong. The mechanism was invisible, operating beneath conscious awareness, directing your observation toward unwanted outcomes, while you believed you were just being responsible and realistic. Now you know, you understand the mechanism. You see how resistance creates observation, how observation collapses probability, how probability manifests as experience. You can't unknow this. And once you truly see it, your relationship with reality fundamentally shifts. You stop being someone who experiences unwanted things and tries to escape them. You become someone who recognizes their collapsing probability through observation and learns to direct that function consciously. The final piece is understanding that this isn't a technique you use occasionally when you remember. This is a fundamental reorganization of how you interface with reality. The shift from unconscious resistant observation to conscious directed observation is a developmental stage in consciousness, not a practice you do. Some people implement this immediately, their entire experience transforming within weeks. Others understand it intellectually, but continue operating from resistance for months or years before the recognition deepens enough to change their actual observation patterns. Where you fall on that spectrum depends on your readiness to see reality differently, your willingness to verify through direct experience rather than defending your current worldview, your capacity to sit with the discomfort of recognizing how much of your unwanted experience was perpetuated by your own observation patterns. There's no judgment in any of this. Consciousness evolves at its own pace, but the opportunity is available now. You can choose in this moment to begin operating differently, not perfectly, not instantly, but to begin, to notice when you're in resistance, to recognize resistant observation as a probability collapsing measurement, to consciously redirect toward wanted present observation, to practice the protocols I've given you, to verify through your own experience whether this mechanism is real, and to gradually, progressively shift from unconscious resistance-based observation to conscious presence-based observation. The unwanted patterns in your life, the recurring experiences you've been trying to escape, they're not permanent features of your reality. They're probability patterns being continuously recreated through resistant observation, and the moment you stop that continuous measurement, they begin to dissolve. Not because you've defeated them, but because you've stopped the mechanism that was making them probable. This is the one paradox that makes you stop attracting what you don't want, not through fighting harder, but through finally understanding what resistance actually does and choosing to observe differently. Reality is waiting to reorganize itself around your conscious observation. The only question is, will you continue measuring what you don't want through resistance, or will you learn to direct your consciousness toward what you actually want through presence? The choice, and the probability field that collapses from that choice, is entirely yours.